lot of the processes, I mean, we'll talk about Alzheimer's, heart disease, those things. A lot of those, my hypothesis is that they result from a degradation of the plasma membrane. That if you can keep your membrane intact and resilient, you will live a long time.
Welcome to the Evolving Past Alzheimer's podcast, where we are focused on bringing you information to help prevent from developing and improve from suffering with brain diseases like Alzheimer's and other dementias. I'm Dr. Nate Bergman, a physician and Chief Scientific Wellness Officer at Kemper Cognitive Wellness, and I'll be your guide on these sound waves. So whether you're a baby boomer who's worried that your brain wiring just isn't working like it once was, or you have a loved one with the disease, or you yourself have already been diagnosed and are wondering, what do I do now? You'll want to listen to this podcast. Each episode, we introduce you to the top doers and thinkers that are revisioning Alzheimer's, dementia, and just generally things in life's second half. If you have questions or comments, check us out on social media. To support us, go to patreon.com/evolvingpast and consider hitting the button and becoming a patron of this show if you find these episodes valuable. That's Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/evolvingpast. So here we go. Let's get better. Welcome back to the show. We have like a really fascinating show here today. And normally, I don't focus so much, even when we have academicians on, I don't tend to focus so much on their background. But this week, we have Dr. Hemal Patel, and I want to focus on his background because I think the perspective of where someone like him, who's, you'll hear yourself, but decades in sort of classic lab-based academic research, which is no easy, it's no sort of cakewalk in terms of making it a career. He's had a successful career at, and continues to have a successful career here. But he also has had his own experiences, particularly with meditation, which we'll talk about, that are now to some degree, and I don't want to let the cat out of the bag before we get into it so much, but that have to some degree informed the work that he's doing in the lab. And so let me just give you the introduction here. So Dr. Hemal Patel is a full professor and is the vice chair for research in the Department of Anesthesiology at University of California, San Diego. And for those people that don't know UC San Diego, for a long time, it's been really a very, very top flight place in the United States for studies on brain and consciousness. And so he runs a vibrant research program. So many people kind of working under him from high school all the way through PhDs and MDs that already have their own degrees and are doing postdoctorate type of work. And so a very, very big operation that he's managing. And his laboratory is focused on understanding cell biology as it relates to stress adaptation. And we will talk about that. And his work more recently has focused on what we would call a biological signature resulting from meditation and the potential of this to transform health resilience. So welcome to the show, Dr. Patel.
All right, thanks a lot, Nate.
And we will angle in this. We will somehow make our way towards, okay, what is this? What might this mean for Alzheimer's, right? So the way I found out about you, Dr. Patel, is I had a patient who went to a Joe Dispenza conference. And for those that don't know Joe Dispenza, he's sort of kind of a neuroscience. I think he's a chiropractor by his background and training, but he's sort of talking about consciousness and meditation and neuroscience, and he's leading people on sort of these transformative experiences. But a lot of people would criticize, well, where's the data? Where's the evidence? He's sort of like, you could say he's a soothsayer or, whatever people say about the snake oil salesman or something. But he had you present at the conference, and we'll put the link to the show notes for your talk there. But I was super intrigued by the talk that you gave. My patient had said, hey, you got to watch the talk by this guy. And then I was really interested when you started towards the last piece of the talk, last maybe third of the talk, where you had stuck in some stuff about the potential for Alzheimer's. But can you just kind of first, so you've been involved in a laboratory environment for a couple decades now. And when did you kind of broach into meditation or kind of what you're doing now? Can you give us a lay of the land a little bit?
Yeah, so I when I went to undergrad, this is when you're discovering yourself, and so I went to a small liberal arts college in the middle of nowhere, Missouri, called Truman State University. It was actually Northeast Missouri State University, and then the Truman Foundation gave them a gobful of money, so they changed their name to the Truman State University. The
Oh,
claim to fame for this town, Kirksville, Missouri, is that it is the town where the founding school of osteopathy was
osteopathic
founded.
medicine, AT
Yeah,
still. I'm an
AT still.
osteopathic. I went to school in Kansas City. I'm from
Oh,
Kansas
you
City,
did?
so
Okay.
we it
So
was our
there is
rival.
a huge tie with KCOM and Truman with the
Yeah,
sciences and the
right,
integration.
right.
I remember spending time at KCOM, listening to seminars and things like that. And so the advantage of this liberal arts education was that I knew I wanted to be a biologist to some capacity. As an Indian male, and a female as well, your two choices were you either become a lawyer or a doctor. And so science was in the cards to move down. I think it was to my parents' chagrin that I ended up being a scientist because they're like, what is a PhD? What is that going to look like, kind of thing. And so Truman was a place where I really tried to discover my brain and my capacity and what I could do. Biology came very natural to me. As a liberal arts major, you had to major in, or you had to take classes and things outside of your main focus. And so you were encouraged to take high level history, philosophy, um, uh, literature, those sorts of things. And so I took a survey to philosophy class my first semester, intro to philosophy, and I fell in love. I mean, it was just amazing learning about how people think about the world and their existence and all of these things. I did well in the course, and the professor asked me to take her next course, and so I did. And then I took the next one, and then the next one. And so it turns out that I actually double majored in biology and then philosophy of religion.
Oh wow.
And so this is where my exposure to meditation first came. I grew up as a Hindu, but never really knew much about it. And so I took my first Eastern religion class when I was I think a sophomore or junior in college, and I was blown away. And the two people who have formed my sort of psyche in terms of religious upbringing are two Germans. One was Lloyd Pfluger, who was a German who ended up living in India for a number of years and converted to Hinduism and taught all sorts of Eastern religion. He was my first guru. So he and I, you meet at his house. He teaches you how to do the breathing, and then he gives you a mantra. And so to this day, he and I are the only ones that share this unique cosmic sound that he whispered into my ear.
Hmm.
It's only been said once, and I still practice it once in a while when I'm super stressed, and it puts me into this calm state. I did this quite a bit as an undergrad, and then sort of lost it for about 25 years until I found Joe and have started back into this path. The other German that formed my sort of religious psyche was Mark Appold. He was a local pastor at the Lutheran Church. I had my girlfriend at the time was someone I met in high school, who I'm married to now. We've been married 22 years. She was a cradle Catholic, and so I knew
Hmm.
nothing about Christianity, and so I explored this in college as well. And Dr. Appold was a Renaissance man. He spoke seven languages, all of
Wow.
the original biblical languages. I actually took Koine Greek from him, which is biblical Greek, and so for a time I could read parts of the New Testament in Greek. These days, it's all Greek to me. Can't make
Uh,
sense, heads or tails of any of it, kind of
it's a good
stuff.
way to impress the in-laws, though. It's a
It
good way to
is,
impress
isn't
them.
it? Yeah. So when
Read the Old
I
Testament or
actually,
New Testament in the original. It's pretty
I
cool.
know. And I did impress the in-laws because I actually went through a conversion.
Mm.
So when my mother passed away in 2014, I had sort of an awakening, and I questioned everything and where my life was headed, and it led me down this path. And I am now a practicing Catholic, and
Hmm.
I've thrown myself completely in. There's really some amazing elements of mysticism and healing and all of these things in the Catholic faith that tie completely in line with what I know and learn and think about meditation in. And some of the original meditators were Catholics, which is kind of an interesting circle. There is a huge stream of meditative practice that came out of the Catholic faith, and sort of tying around that as a religious entity has been quite interesting to look at. So that's sort of how I ended up in terms of my training in biology and this intertwining of biology and life sciences with this grounding in philosophy and religion. And so my biology was always informed by this sense that there's something greater, right? There's too much order and orientation in life to have it be random. So there is this first principle, something that created life out of potentially nothing or stuff that existed. And when I look at biology, I mean, every time I look at a cell under a microscope, I'm just absolutely amazed at the intricacies that it took to create that life. And so a lot of my research is focused on this primary cell, right? Where did life start? And if you think about it, it was a bag of chemicals that were coalesced into a rounded space by a physical membrane. And my lab has focused on biological membranes for the past 20 years and how they regulate physiology, adaptation, endurance, thriving, all sorts of elements. And this is where we sort of really fixated in the basic science elements. I trained as a classic cardiovascular physiologist at the Medical College of Wisconsin. Um, I'm the
Another good
only.
place.
What's that?
Another good place.
It
Another
is.
place of note.
It's one of these wholesome Midwestern places to learn and grow and think. I'm the only PhD in a family of MD, so all of the kids have trained at different places. Um, and so it was a unique way of looking at the world, right? It's not fixing the problem, but trying to figure out the nuts and bolts of the problem so that someone can fix it eventually. And so, as a cardiac physiologist, the focus was looking at the opioid system in the heart as a protective modality against heart attack. When I moved to UCSD to do my postdoc, the focus really turned to how the membrane creates cell biology and imprinting. And we looked at a lot of opioid receptor signaling on the plasma membrane and its input into cell biology. But my lab has really turned into how the cell works at a living organism, basic unit kind of thing. And then ultimately, how the membrane communicates with intracellular organelles like the mitochondria to manage energy balance and those sorts of things to then adapt to stress.
So
And
that's
this is,
like, so just to put that in a different
yeah,
terms, would it be accurate to say that, you're talking about membrane, you're talking about the cell membrane, so how the perimeter or the edges or the border barrier of the what's going on out there influences the inner workings, organelles, etc.,
yeah,
within the cell. Okay.
right. Yeah, and I have given talks all over the world, and we did a survey a couple of years ago where I just had some techs in the lab go and ask questions of students on the campus, and I had them take a picture of a cell, and they just basically asked, "What's the most important part of a cell?" And as you'd expect, most people said the nucleus, right? It's the brain of the cell. It's where all the nucleic acids are and controls all the biology. The next biggest thing was the mitochondria, and then some fancy people said ribosome or ER crap like that. Very few people said the membrane, and I would argue that you can't have life or the cell without the membrane. It is absolutely the most important component of the cell, and so we've really sort of fixated on that as the conduit for how a cell behaves. A lot of the processes, I mean, we'll talk about Alzheimer's, heart disease, those things. A lot of those, my hypothesis is that they result from a degradation of the plasma membrane. That if you can keep your membrane intact and resilient, you will live a long time and very
So,
healthy.
can you paint a little bit more of a picture about, okay, so plasma membrane. So, just what is that? How does that happen? Just briefly, even.
Yeah, so the membrane is what defines the borders of a cell, like you said, right? And there's trillions of cells in your body. Each cell has a unique membrane composition. It's made up of lipids, fat kinds of molecules that have a polar head and a lipid tail. There's proteins that are dispersed throughout this, and then there's molecules such as cholesterol, glycosingolipids, and other things that give it some flavor. My laboratory has been studying cholesterol rich microdomains in the plasma membrane. I joke that if you're having a heart attack, the first thing you should do is go have a fatty meal, like have a really fatty hamburger, because that cholesterol is going to be protecting your heart from that ischemic event. And there's a lot of evidence that we have in the lab that if you can architecture these microdomains, so we've made a mouse that has two different flavors. We've upregulated this protein called caveolin specifically in the heart and
Yeah.
specifically in the brain. When we make this protein go up in the heart, these hearts are resilient to all kinds of stressors: acute ischemic injury, heart failure, diabetes, aging. They don't age. And basically, these animals live a really, really, really long time. And they live this in a very healthy way. Usually, what happens in a mouse is a 2-year-old mouse is comparable like an 70, 80-year-old human. They're sort of hunched over in a cave. They're not grooming themselves. It's like, basically you've given up on life. These overexpressors, they're just moving around like they're 3 months old, like they're teenagers. Nothing really bothers them. They're able to activate and do their thing. Um, Same way we've, working with Brian Head in the laboratory as a collaborator, he's made some really amazing strides with expressing this protein caveolin in the plasma membrane of neurons. And we see the same resilience. These animals think better when they get older. It seems to be a potential target to treat neurodegenerative diseases, such as ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and we've got animal data to support all of that in. And we actually have a patent that was picked up by a company that's pushing this hopefully along in the next couple years to move this into a human clinical trial, which would be amazing. But it all revolves around making the membrane more resilient and stronger.
Hmm. And is this something that someone would go eventually to get gene therapy for, or is there another way? Like, how do your interests in these sort of that layer or level of something you need to see under a microscope and sometimes quite powerful
Yeah,
microscopes, not just the usual microscopes.
right.
How does that dovetail with your interest in kind of meditation and certainly more recent interest,
Right.
that you
Yeah.
mentioned?
So the lazy man's way is gene therapy, right?
Uh,
We have a target. We know what it is. We can express it in your cells, and here you go. There are outside interventions that will raise this protein. We have not looked particularly with meditation, but what we have seen in the literature is that if you exercise, this protein goes up in your heart. So there, that sort of ties the link between exercise and living longer. Um, there was a study that came out of China years ago that showed that if you maze trained animals, you would see more of this protein in neurons. So, suggesting that if you're mentally using the neurons, this is a way to drive the expression of this protein. And then there's, anecdotal evidence of this that if you work your brain, you potentially have mitigation of symptoms of Alzheimer's for a longer period of time. And it could be tied to this upregulation of this protein. It's going to be very interesting to see if meditation and what Joe does is very different than mindfulness. I describe it to people as mindfulness and headspace and all this stuff is drinking water out of a sippy cup, whereas with Joe, you're drinking water out of a fire hose. I mean, these are intensive experiences where you're elevating your mental, emotional energy, those kinds of states to a level where I mean, it's indescribable. I mean, it is just you're in this ultimate euphoric state sometimes if you get to that level, and it changes your biology. And I would imagine that that's driving caveolins and other proteins through the roof in your neurons.
right.
Something we'll eventually test, but we'd have to be able to get a biopsy, which I don't know who's going to volunteer for that.
All right. So, so a couple of again, I'm super interested in some of the things that you've even presented potentially about COVID-19 and immune
Yeah,
system,
yeah,
there's this whole you have this really a long track record with mitochondria, so energy centers in the energy producing centers in our cells, in multiple kinds of cells, certainly brain cells, heart cells, all the cells that you mentioned,
yeah,
really every cell basically. Um, and there's a thread of literature going back, as you probably know as well as I, um, quite a while now, and has been considered until fairly recently an alternative hypothesis to the kind of usual hypothesis about how Alzheimer's and other dementias, but particularly Alzheimer's, develops, and is now sort of finding its place again as some of the more traditional theories about amyloid and tau are, I wouldn't say replaced, but are now sort of, we're realizing the limitations
Yeah.
or the other influences on some of the things that drive Alzheimer's disease. So mitochondria, um, there are a lot of serious people doing serious research that are thinking about, okay, are there mitochondrial strategies? And I'll tell you, just in clinical practice, for some people, when we kind of push the mitochondrial lever, and it's not everyone, but when we start to use some of the things that will optimize mitochondria, starting with diet, exercise, food, and there's certain kinds of exercise, and getting people sleeping right and oxygenating correctly, and getting rid of things that will seem to damage or hold back
Yeah.
or create problems with mitochondria. Usually, people fare a little bit better, and sometimes they do much better. So there's all these threads that I saw that you've been kind of interested or have data on. Can you
Yeah.
though explain a little bit, because I think it might be interesting to put the kind of the story of what you did with the Dispenza conference, like the novice meditators versus the uh, people that didn't meditate versus people that were more experienced. Can you kind of just describe the way you set up data collection for the Dispenza,
Yeah.
meditation on steroids experience?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, people have done research on meditation, like Deepak Chopra, some others, and I think it just hasn't. They've started scratching the surface, and I think we've just started scratching the surface as well. There's so much to do, and it really, for a scientist, one of the things I learned as a early scientist in grad school was that your experiment means nothing unless you have the right controls, and if you're controlling for various factors that'll allow you to get rid of things that may be noise. And so Joe's environment that we have access to in terms of his subjects is phenomenal, right? They're a captive audience, so they're usually at a resort for a week at a time. Some of his advanced follow ups are only 3 days, but again, they're all in the same place. You're all in the same schedule. You're all eating relatively the same food. Everyone eats the same breakfast. Everyone eats the same lunch. You have a choice of maybe 3 or 4 restaurants at the hotel for dinner. So it's not a huge change
Right.
in sort of consumption. And then you're on all on the same time schedule. Everyone gets up. One of the striking things for me was, some of these meditations start at 4 in the morning. Scientists don't wake up very early. And so I'm like, who is going to show up at 3:30 to do this silly meditation that lasts 4.5 hours? I get there at 3:45. Luckily, I've got friends who are saving me spots because they know they've been to these before. The room is packed. I mean, there's people everywhere buzzing around at 3:30 in the morning. I'm like, this is insane. And so it's a committed group. They're here to meditate and elevate their emotion and their state. Um, so the advantage of this is almost a perfectly controlled research environment. You can't recreate this in an academic setting. When we put out flyers, so usually the week-long events have about 1,500 attendees. We get close to 700 people who volunteer to be in a study. We can't take 700 people, and so we've got our pick of the crowd, right? We can easily get age matching, male, female. We can get ethnicities from all over the world. Usually, it's about 30 to 50 countries of people that end up coming to an event. And so you've got lots of things you can manipulate in an experimental setting.
Right.
And then the way we built it in is the controls have always been difficult. And so what we've fixated on are vacationing controls. So these are spouses of people attending the workshop but not going through the workshop. So I call them the Mai Tai drinkers, right? They're sitting at the pool, relaxed all the time, and they're experiencing relaxation.
So where
We
you
were,
can't, because a lot of the criticism, as you are no doubt more aware than I am, is if you take a group of people that are on a resort meditating
yeah,
versus people that are at home grinding in their jobs, of
yeah,
course they're going to have better markers of stressors because
right,
they're they're on vacation, right? Even if
yeah,
it's an intense meditation experience. So here, as your comparison, your control group, you're taking people that are basically on vacation.
right. And then eventually we want to put in those working controls as well. I think they're going to tell you something about what stress does through the week, right? They're not being managed in any way. And so we would expect that their response will be very different from the vacationing controls versus the two experimental groups we're looking at. The two experimental groups we look at then are the novice meditators. And so we've put in a cutoff of they've never been to a live event and they've been meditating less than 6 months. And so they're really new to the practice. No one's really guided them down this path. And then our experienced meditators, most of them have been to 3, 5+ events. They meditate more than an hour a day, and it's a part of who they are, what they are, and it's part of their daily lifestyle. The other control we built in is that every person gives us a pre-workshop sample, and so we get to see where they're at in their basal state before they start the intensive workshop. And then we get a sample at the end of the workshop, so we get to see the accumulated effect over the week.
Right.
And now, as we've seen that effect in the dramatic phases, we're starting to sample in the middle as well to look at circadian biology, to start looking at spot collections after someone has a gamma level event. Do we see
Okay, so
change?
we got super technical, which I'm very interested in, and actually many of
Yeah.
our listeners.
We can
But can
go
we
back.
just,
Yeah, we can go to the
yeah?
technical aspects of that. Yeah.
So you mentioned you're collecting blood, right? And you're
Yeah.
collecting from the blood. You're able to get between 10 and, I mean, in some cases hundreds or thousands of pieces of information off of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and so you're measuring blood levels before this week
Yeah.
of activity, and then initially, at least in the initial designs, at the end of this week
7 day.
of
Yeah.
activity.
7 day
Yeah,
workshop. Yeah.
7-day workshop in people
Right.
that were new and people that were, and then also people that were just sort of kicking it by the pool,
Right.
drinking cocktails.
And the idea is that blood is a capture of whatever's happened in the brain, right? During those meditative experiences, you're releasing factors that we think we can capture in the blood. We've now expanded. We've always done saliva, so we think that that's a potential capture. In Marco Island coming up in January, I'm going to ask the large bulk of the audience to give us their feces as well. We want to look at the microbiome. We think that that's a major conduit for how life and biology happen, and so we want to start looking at that. And then we'll eventually get to urine and every body fluid you could imagine. We're going to start measuring stuff in. But blood has really been the main focus over the last 12 to 18 months. And in blood, you can get metabolites, which are representation of your microbiome and other cellular metabolic processes that are happening. So as your mitochondria are using energy, they'll slough stuff off into the blood. The blood also has cells that we can get really fine information about the gene profile that's being expressed. And lots of studies have shown that peripheral blood markers in terms of RNA, DNA could be correlated to tissue level markers as well. Um, and then we're starting to look at proteins in the blood as well. So this gives you an idea of how the genetic signature manipulates proteins at a level. And this is all because we can't get access to tissue, right? No one's going to allow us to cut a chunk of
The
a heart or
brain, yeah, the
something
heart,
like
yeah.
that. And so this was actually born out of a study that we had undertaken with NASA. We were involved in the twin study where the Kelly twins, one was on ground for a year, the other one was up in space for a year. And the idea was to use blood as a surrogate to look at stress responses in this crazy environmental shift, right? And it's an N of one, but they're genetically identical. So it's a really cool N of one experiment.
Yeah, yeah, very
And
good.
so we were able to design a plate-based assay to look at metabolism. And so we could literally use the twins' plasma as a way to see what was happening in cells in their body by artificially imprinting cells in a plate that we could look at metabolism on. And so we're applying a lot of these sort of techniques we've gleaned from other basic science experiments to Joe's research. And I don't think anyone's really done that at a deep level.
And there's another group of people, uh, sort of researchers, if you will, that are also looking at brain waves and
Yeah,
brain signatures. And okay, so there's a lot of different vantage points and looks or layers, if you will,
yeah.
um, that you're trying to put together with these people. So what have you seen so far? I mean, if you share some of the kinds of things you're seeing and in the different groups, right? Are the
Yeah.
people that are just on vacation getting better? Do they
They it depends on what you look at. Some of them do, some of them don't. And
right?
and one of the things we're trying to control for is if they're vacationing next to someone who's having a crazy brain experience throughout their meditation, is that person rubbing off on them during nighttime when they're in bed together, right? And so
Wow, that's interesting. What do you mean a crazy brain experience? Like, like you mentioned before a term called a gamma level experience. Can
yeah,
you just
so
unpack that a bit?
our brains are in different phases of activity, and we can record electrical currents that come off of it as a way of being where you are in your basic activity. So, us sitting around right now, we're probably in beta, mid beta, that kind of thing, where we're thinking, brain processes are happening. Once you become more relaxed, your brain moves into an alpha wave form. If you're super relaxed, you're in theta. If you're asleep, you're probably in delta wave activity. But then there's this hyper arousal phase where you move into gamma, where your brain is just processing at a very, very high level. We see these gamma level events in a lot of meditators. I mean, I think when we're mapping them during meditations, probably 6 out of 15 kind of thing. So about half, more close to half of them have these gamma level events, and they fluctuate. So the idea is that if you have had this gamma level event, the electromagnetic shift in what's ever happening to your electricity and your brain activity and things, those are going to linger and last, right? And so people around you are going to be impacted by this activity. One of the things I've noticed is that meditating here in my office by myself creates I can get into a state, right? I'm probably in a coherent alpha. My brain's very boring. I have
Yeah.
so much analytical activity going on that it takes me a lot of energy to get to that non-energy sort of high level state. Um, but when I'm in a room with 1,000 other meditators, it's much easier for me to do. And I
Hmm.
think there is this pattern of sensing the room and feeling the energy that drives what you're doing as well. And so there is this sense of community, I think, that develops. And so I would suspect that maybe there's some imprint on a spouse sleeping next to someone who's had gamma level events during their experience throughout the day.
Well, it's so
Where,
interesting. Even if you just think about what the brain, these so-called EEG waves are doing. I mean,
yeah,
essentially what they're doing is looking at things in synchrony, right? So, like when you
yeah,
say the brain's going this fast or that fast, I mean, it's a synchronization of or a rhythm that it, so many cells are going through that it becomes you say like the music that the brain is playing that you could hear as opposed to
yeah.
all of the different kind of activities. So you'd think, okay, theoretically, I mean, I guess that's what you guys are testing, but theoretically,
Yeah,
then just like it's easier to swim downstream or it's easier to play what everybody else is playing on a music level, like if you are sitting in a group with many meditators, it might be easier it's like you're swimming with the current instead of against it or playing something
yeah.
that's a different tune. That's super interesting.
I mean,
All
it's
right,
a
so it's
group dynamic, right? There's species that do these. Birds fly in a flock, fish swim in schools and
yeah.
things like that. And so there is this rhythmicity that comes with a group dynamic, and I've seen that in the room. And I won't talk about it today, but we're actually designing some studies to test some of this element of coherence between the larger group and that
Hmm.
sort of thing that we're very interested in. And it gets really into physics, which is not my cup of tea, but I'm starting
Yeah.
to learn and read and figure those things out. But the main focus that we've had is trying to figure out if the blood from a meditator does stuff, and we've been looking at a lot of stuff. The first event that we were at was in Indian Wells in 2020 in February, which was, ignorance is bliss kind of thing. We all know what happened in March 2020.
Yeah.
Everything sort of shut down. Our labs did as well. So we had all these samples in the lab. No one could get in to do anything with them. And so we started to rejigger the lab to look at stuff that would allow us to come back in. And so we started focusing on COVID based research. And so we made a couple pseudoviruses. And so these are viruses that look like SARS CoV 2, but they're not virulent, they're not infectious, they don't create the morbid disease, but they allow us to track how the virus would behave in a normal cell. And so we could do that in my BSL2 facility that I have in the lab. Um, and so the thought was, well, we've got this plasma from these meditators. Let's just throw it on and see what happens, right? And so we did these experiments called adoptive transfer experiments. So the concept is a little, it takes a little bit of thought to think about what we're doing, right? So the meditators are having these events in their brain. The brain is releasing factors or changing the blood biochemistry. And so the idea is that that blood is the capture of that meditative experience, and you have to make the leap to believe that.
Yeah.
If you believe that, then that blood has elements of meditation that we should be able to transfer into a system that's never seen meditation. So we're adopting that effect into cells, basically in a dish.
In other
And
words,
so,
would this be an accurate way to say this? In other words, you'd say, "Hey, I want to get a medicinal property. I want to identify the medicinal property of medication of meditation." So I know this is not what you did, but maybe it's
yeah,
an analogy. So you say, "Hey, I want this person, like this group. They do this very intense meditation. I'm going to take some of their blood, and then I'll inject it in someone who didn't do the meditation, and see if the things that the medicinal qualities that the blood contained in the meditator would then be medicinal in someone who didn't necessarily meditate."
yes. So it's like that, right?
Yeah.
It's taking someone who's gone through an experience and then saying the blood has captured that experience, and we're going to transfer that experience to something that's
Yeah.
never seen that experience. An
Okay.
adoptive experiment. In sort of human studies and in animal studies, that's called parabiosis, right?
Sure.
You're transferring one element to the other, kind of thing. And some aging stuff has been done, which is pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. Alzheimer's too.
Um,
Yeah.
and so the idea with this adoptive experiment was, if the lung is the primary site of infection, could you model lung cells in a dish and then have them sit in this plasma from these meditators? And we've got the pre-post from controls, new meditators, experienced meditators. So they sat in this for an hour, and then we came in and challenged them with this pseudovirus, and we looked to see how much virus got in, because there's a red reporter. And so if the virus gets in, it turns the cell red, and we can basically count how much red signal there is. Interestingly, what we noticed was that the blood from an experienced meditator after the week long meditation event, there's less red signal that gets into those lung cells, suggesting that there's something that's being elevated in the plasma of an experienced meditator after an intensive week long experience that prevents that virus from getting in, the
Hmm.
SARS-CoV-2 virus from getting in. We've subsequently shown that the same thing happens against the Delta variant as well, and we're in the process of testing the alphabet soup, the alpha, beta, gamma, you name it, variants as
Yeah.
well. And the data looks interesting for the other variants, but we've got pretty clear data for Delta as well as the original strain, that there's something inside the blood of a meditator that prevents this. And so then we went through a bunch of subtractive experiments to figure out, well, what is it in the blood that's doing this? And so we heated the sample. When you heat the sample, denature all the proteins, that protective effect is gone. So we know that it's a protein. Um, we then actually fished the protein out. You can take an antibody and then look at the complex, fish it all out, put it on a mass spectrometer, and then the mass spectrometer will tell you the identification of the proteins. From that, we were able to build a map, identify one that looked like an interesting target, and then we've actually done gain and loss of function studies with that target to validate it. And so
Hmm.
we know with pretty good clarity one protein that's elevated in all of the experienced meditators that creates this effect. So we're working on the paper right now. So that's I've promised it to the community to come out sometime in January. So we're going to put a preprint out in January. So look out for that, and then it'll
Yeah.
be submitted for publication somewhere. And we're going to go big. I mean, I think it's such a cool data set that I think it's going to be a big journal.
Cell
Tied to
environment. Yeah.
this, we actually did a survey across the world. So we did this backwards, right? We did the survey after we had figured out what the thing inside the thing was.
Yeah.
We had about 3,000 people from 66 countries respond about their meditative experience, how much they meditate with Joe Dispenza, how often they meditate, and their COVID diagnosis rates. And it turns out that those that are meditating more than 6 months have about a 50% decrease in COVID positivity. And there's a dosing effect. So if you meditate once a week versus once a day, you're better off if you meditate once a day in terms of this COVID profile. And then what's even crazier is, if you were COVID positive and you were meditating more than 6 months, your symptomology is almost non existent. You have very little brain fog, zero
Hmm.
lung congestion in this group. And so the population data seems to fit very nicely with the cell and molecular data that we've developed. And
Yeah.
so the idea is really to use this as a platform to study everything, right? So we're going to do this as a platform to study Alzheimer's disease, ALS. We're starting to do this as a model for cancer, and we've got, my lab can cell model any disease you could imagine. We've got models
Yeah.
for diabetes, neurodegeneration,
So
cancer,
so
all of
so it's amazing, and that was with the generalizability. When was watching it and reading, I just was like, wow, it's if any aspect of this turns out to be true, um, it's it's so impactful. Can you kind of skate over to the what you saw with Alzheimer's or amyloid precursor protein? Can you kind of describe what you saw there at the protein level?
Yeah. So we looked at plasma proteins, and so we again, this is mass spec, which is amazing
And just
science.
to clarify for everybody, plasma is part of the
Blood
blood. It's a
plasma,
blood
yeah.
product.
So
Okay.
so blood has formed and unformed elements, and your plasma has basically it's the unformed components of the blood, and so that metabolites proteins, other
Okay.
things. And so with this mass spec, you can look at like 650 proteins all at one time. And so we looked at these, shot them through the mass spec, and we saw the different groups come up. It was interesting that when we had the computer cluster these proteins patterns by what looked similar, the computer instinctively, or not, I mean, hierarchically clustered the pre-meditation apart from the post-meditation. And so what this suggested to us is that that meditative experience created a set of proteins irrespective of the genetics that was there. This was, I
Mm.
mean, this was an
Yeah.
unexpected finding, right? So it really
So
says that nurture has the ability to create an environment,
so
genetic environment.
regardless of the genes, to some
Yeah,
degree,
yeah,
regardless of the genes, whether they're higher risk for a disease, in this case we're talking about Alzheimer's, etc., like regardless of that risk, there still seems to be a benefit whether or not you have a genetic risk or not. Is that what you're
right.
saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the proteins that come out, so your genes would theoretically create a series of proteins, right? And so in these meditators, we had pretty good ethnic diversity, male female diversity, aging diversity. So, irrespective of all of those things, the proteins that came out looked very similar, suggesting that it's the meditation that's creating the proteins and not necessarily the genetics that you are born with. When we started looking at the novice meditators, we noticed that there were about 26, 27 proteins that changed significantly. What was striking is that the directionality of all of these was always in the same way. So either they always went up in all 15, 16 participants we were looking at, or they all went down in the same direction. The absolute change was different, but the directionality was the same, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
One of the proteins that we saw this in was APP, this amyloid precursor protein. And there's a couple papers. The literature is sort of weird about this. Some suggest that it's a marker for Alzheimer's. Some suggest that it's potentially a way to screen out of this. So high and low levels mean different things. I found a series of papers that suggested that a low level of soluble APP could be a way to suggest that you're less at risk for Alzheimer's. And so that's what we're sort of basing this result on. And we noticed that in these 11 or so novice meditators, irrespective of age, all of them had this high level of this circulating APP. And after 7 days of meditation, they all went to this really, really low level of circulating APP, suggesting that you're somehow, when you're elevating your emotion and your mind state, that you're clearing a lot of this stuff that may be going on that may lead to this,
Yeah,
neuro.
interesting. Are you able to look at the next step products? You know, what happens to ABP where it's cleaved, either like a
Yeah, so that's
beta
there.
site
That's
or a gamma
something.
site?
Yeah, so that's something we're interested in starting to look at. And we've got people here. I mean, like you mentioned, UCSD is the World Center for Neuroscience and AD Research and those sorts of
Yeah,
things. And so we'll hook up with Steve Wagner and some others that are doing this kind
beautiful.
of thing.
Yeah,
The other thing that we've just put in an NIH grant to look at how meditation changes neurodegenerative diseases. And in this, we propose a series of adoptive transfer experiments where we're going to take iPSCs, these stem cells from patients who have Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, and we can grow them into neurons, and then do the same experiment we did with the COVID virus kind of thing, right? Put the
yeah,
plasma from these meditators onto those cells and see if you can change the behavior of what an Alzheimer's cells will look like. That would give us the first glimpse that there's something that's being secreted that creates this protective potential from neurodegeneration. And then
yeah.
we can go to town, right? You can start injecting this into mouse models. You could practice this in humans and see what happens.
Yeah, so that's actually what I mean. I'd love to kind of angle this back into the practical as we think about where you're. So you've talked about potential benefits for multiple disease states. You mentioned Alzheimer's. You certainly saw it in a sort of an experimental something that looks like or behaves like COVID-19.
Yeah.
That it seems to have like a pretty clear personality or signature, if you will, in the blood. If someone says, "Okay, I love what Dr. Patel lab is doing, but I have a problem now. I'm not sure I can wait until 2, 3, 6 years until it's worked out."
Right.
Um, what would be like people are going to start and say, "Okay, well, it may be expensive to go to Dr. Dispenza's thing, or it might be like." Do you have a sense of what seems like a reasonable? I know you're not a teacher of meditation, and
Right.
you're sort of fairly early in on collecting data. Although you've been doing this for a year and a half at this point. But um, what seems like a reasonable place to start? You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
I was a meditation skeptic for a long time, even though I did this when I was in undergrad, and we had these samples sitting in my freezer for months, and then we finally looked, and Joe had been trying to get me to come to an event for about a year. I said, "Man, I'm busy. I got stuff going on. I'm running a giant lab. I got things to do. I've got 3 kids at home." And then the data just kept coming out. It was just one amazing thing after another, and so I finally went to an event and it was mind blowing. I mean, I was not expecting to experience what I experienced.
What
The
did you
RX,
experience?
so it's very hard to quiet my mind, right? I have so many things going on during the week that I just don't normally do it. One of the things I took away from the workshop is I don't close my eyes enough. I mean, when we're awake, we're awake. And what I notice now is that I will close my office door and just sit quiet for 10 minutes with my eyes closed. And it puts you into this totally different space of being able to interact with others in a more productive way and not in an angry way, seeing other people's perspective. And it's different. And so I'm starting to do that more. I go with this fit and rage kind of thing with the meditations. I
Yeah,
go to
yeah,
an event and I'm like all jacked and ready to go, and I'm going to do this every day. And then, of course, 2 weeks in, you're like, I got to read this grant, and instead
yeah,
of that.
yeah.
So I was just at an advanced follow up in Denver, and so my resolution after that was to meditate every day. And so luckily, I have been able to incorporate some form of meditation into every day. And so you just have to start somewhere. And for
And
a
how
lot of
much time are you able to realistically commit? I mean, because I think a lot of people are busy, maybe not quite as busy as you, but a lot of people relate to just their mind is hectic,
yeah.
their attention is spread thin. It's hard to prioritize this. They're skeptical about meditation. Like,
So
how?
I've set a goal of an hour and a half a day, which seems
Wow.
a
Okay.
lot, but then I think about all of the crappy things I do with my time, right? One of the things that my postdoc mentor always said is there's 24 hours in a day, um, and I tend to fixate on this, right? And I've been thinking about time and how we use time, and so my wife and I went to this one event that Kirk Cameron was running on marriage and
Yeah.
the couple kind of thing. And this guy came up and he was trying to advocate for children in Africa and these things. And he was describing this child who had to walk 5 miles back and forth every day collecting water for the family. So this kid would spend 8 hours of his day bringing
Water.
water, an essential need for their family. And he said, I want you to go home today and think about how far you have to walk to get water. And in my house, I have access to water at 6 different spots within 20 seconds of each other, right? And so,
Right.
what the hell am I doing with the 7 hours and whatever other
Right.
time I have that I don't have to collect water for my family? And it really made me think about where we waste our time. And we
Right.
waste so much time doing stuff that just is toxic to our brains. I mean, I watch a lot of Netflix and Hulu
Yeah.
and things
Yeah.
like that, and we're in
Yeah.
a digital world, right? I spend a lot of time on my phone and trying to
Yeah.
turn that off. And so working in an hour and a half of meditation seems like nothing into that scheme of wastage that I have in my day. And so I tend to do it at different times. So I've been doing it on the weekends at nighttime. So right before I go to bed,
Yeah.
I do these calming meditations. So a lot of these meditations have an energy drive component to them. And so if you do them in the morning, you're driven the whole day and you just don't shut off. They're phenomenal. And there's
And are
others that really
these
shut your
meditations
system down.
Oh, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to ask you about the content. Is this something that you put on headphones and you listen and you're guided through, or is this something you sort of learn to guide yourself through at this point?
Yeah, so I'm not a very good guide of myself, so I use
Yeah,
Joe as my guide, and so I've got a
great.
lot of his meditations, and I work through them, and we actually have a meditation group that formed in San Diego.
Yeah,
Um, the first event I was at was Orlando in April of 2021. And someone came up to me and said, "Hey, do you mind if we form a group in San Diego around your research? And we'd be happy to participate." I'm like, "Sounds cool." So it
yeah.
started with about 6 or 7 core people, and now it's like 65 people that have formed. And we meet every Thursday evening to meditate as a group. And
In
that the
person.
energy that room is amazing. Usually about 20, 25 people show up to these in-person meditations.
Well, so the only thing I can relate that to is we have sort of conscious ecstatic dance, and we have the same kind of thing. COVID has really, really changed that. Obviously, we haven't
Yeah,
really, we've had some stuff outside, but we haven't had really almost any indoor dancing since February of 2020, probably.
yeah,
And it's I can do some of this stuff on my own, sort of a moving meditation, if you will. But when you're with other people, even if it's not in synchrony and everybody's sort of kind of doing variations of their own thing,
yeah.
it really, I mean, it's a whole different experience. Have you
Yeah.
tried it? I mean, have you tried it online? Like, is that something that will
We
work?
have thought about Zoom. We do walking meditations as a group on weekends sometimes. I've made it to one, I think. They
Okay,
do them all
right,
the time.
yeah,
And on the beach where you can have lots of space to walk out in,
yeah,
and then you've got
yeah.
headphones on and you're listening that way. The space has been nice because it's a large space that one of our meditators has a large gym, and so she opens it up to the group, and you can literally
Fantastic.
spread out. And she's got this amazing speaker system, like you're at an event, listening to Joe chime in, and we'll go through different meditations that he has, and they're all Joe people, and so they're all into his meditative
And
practices.
stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any?
Um,
Do you think anything special about his? I mean, so you're a person that has, like a all the background that you have. You found sort of Christian Catholic contemplative meditation, contemplative prayer. I mean, there's a whole rich world of meditation that I'm aware of within the
yeah,
Christian and certainly even really Catholic faith, by
yeah, yeah.
sort of in and of itself. Is there anything that you feel like Joe, like there's something that resonates or is more effective, other than the intensity of the experience, these kind of week long experiences to start things, or
Yeah.
you know what
I
I
mean,
mean?
I think we want to study that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's been something that has been gnawing at me. Is it Joe, or is it the elements of the meditative thing that he does, or can this be replicated with mantra, prayer, and other things as well?
Yeah,
And that's I think a research question that we'll eventually get to, and that we're very interested in looking. There's lots of groups that want to be studied that are doing other things besides Joe meditations.
right.
In my experiences, I see that there's elements that I can achieve with Catholic meditation that are similar as well as unique from what I can achieve with Joe's
Joe's.
meditations. So I think there are differences, and to get that nuance is going to be important. There's something about that the resonance of the music and the information that he carries during his meditations that elevates the brain. I can't put my finger on it. And I mean, he is a master at this. Their group has done a very amazing job curating the music that goes with it, the resonant frequencies it generates, and then he's got just impeccable timing in terms of being able to guide you through these meditations. And it's an art and a skill.
Yeah,
I don't know of many people that can do that. And I mean, he's got the room in a space. I give a lot of talks everywhere, and it's very infrequent. I'm in a room of 1,000 people where everyone is fixated on you as the person speaking. They're always on their phone, writing something,
yeah,
talking to someone.
yeah.
When I'm in the room at these events, no one is distracted. They have their attention and eyes and everything on him and what's happening on stage. It's a group of committed people, and I think it takes a leadership like he has to create that. You know.
Yeah. So that's really so interesting. So then I guess this is of course not medical advice, and we have wordings all over the
Yeah.
the podcast at the beginning. But like, if you if you had to tell someone, said like, I don't know if I could start more than 5 minutes, 10 minutes a day, like,
Yeah.
because people always say, all right, let's say, Doctor, I hear what he's saying. I'm a skeptic
Yeah.
also about meditation. He was a skeptic. But I can't do an hour and a half. Where would you tell people to start?
So where I would tell them, and I think this is where Joe's is very unique from everyone else, is he is convinced that, I mean, he has this line, right? Evidence is the loudest voice. So learn about what you're doing, and the uniqueness of his meditative practice is not that you just sit in a room and you start listening to this music and he guides you through meditation. He tells you for hours on end before you start this meditation of what your brain biology is, what's going to happen, where you're going to head, and you have this knowledge base before you start the meditation. These are available on his website. I don't think they're super expensive. I've never really looked, but they're the entry level that people who can't get to an event. Most people start with the formula, and then he's got these intensive and progressive workshops online.
Yeah.
A lot of people will do these for years before they make it to an actual live event. And some of the stories I've heard of what happens when they start doing learning and then actually meditating with these is they're transformational. And then they're
Yeah.
like me, right? They're in that 12-month phase of being skeptics, but then this changes their life and they figure out how to get to a live event and they go to the next level. So
Amazing.
you got to start somewhere, and a couple minutes. I think learning. He's got a lot of content on YouTube and other places. Learning sort of the background of what he is, who's the ideas that he's trying to teach in terms of the science, and then starting with a basic meditation. They're not super expensive to get, and they walk you through the process.
Yeah. 5-10 minutes a day, even, I think is a reasonable place to start. I don't know, certainly not the doses that seem to move the needle, but like in the process of change, as you know, as well as I, just taking the first step sometimes, and kind of, just get sometimes in order to get the gym to work out, first you just got to
Right.
buy a
Yeah.
pair of shoes and,
Yeah.
like get a membership or something. Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, I want to be respectful of time, and both have a hard stop here, but I thank you so much.
Yeah. No, it's
I'm
great.
gonna follow some of the stuff that's coming out of your lab, because it's really, really exciting. Sort of the layering and sort of the broad applicability of some of the data you're presenting. So
Yeah.
thank
No,
you so much for the work
I'll
you're
see
doing.
you at an event in the future soon.
Absolutely. Thank you. All the best.
All right. Good talking to you.
So that's our episode. I hope it was useful to you. Check out the show notes on iTunes or on our website where we've summarized the key points. If you find the information here valuable, please consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes and leaving comments in the comments section. It will really help us bring this message to as many people as we can. If you have questions or comments, connect with us on social media. Finally, to support us, go to patreon.com/evolvingpast and consider hitting the button and becoming a patron of this show. That's Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/evolvingpast. Thanks. I'll talk to you next time.